What if the worst consequence of your actions was not punishment, but invisibility? What if every moral compromise you made left no mark on your face, your body, or your reputation, but instead accumulated silently somewhere you never had to look? The Picture of Dorian Gray was written by Oscar Wilde and first published in 1890, at the height of Victorian England. Wilde was a novelist, playwright, and sharp social critic, deeply skeptical of moral absolutism and obsessed with beauty, art, and hypocrisy. The novel scandalized its first readers not because it promoted immorality, but because it exposed how easily society disguises it. At the center of the story is Dorian Gray, a young man of extraordinary beauty, whose portrait is painted by the artist Basil Hallward. When Dorian realizes that the painting will age while he remains physically unchanged, he makes a wish that alters the moral structure of his life. From that moment on, the portrait becomes a mirror of his soul, absorbing the visible consequences of his choices, while Dorian himself remains outwardly flawless. This premise is not a fantasy about immortality, it is a psychological experiment. Wilde asks what happens when appearance is permanently severed from consequence. Dorian is surrounded by a society that rewards charm, status, and aesthetic refinement, while quietly tolerating cruelty and excess as long as it remains discreet. In this environment, moral restraint is no longer enforced by shame or accountability, but by optics alone. The novel introduces Lord Henry Wotton, whose influence on Dorian is subtle but corrosive. Lord Henry preaches a philosophy of pleasure, aesthetic experience, and radical self-expression, dismissing conventional morality as an artificial constraint. Yet Wilde does not present him as a villain in the traditional sense. He is witty, intelligent, and intellectually seductive. His danger lies in how easily his ideas dissolve responsibility without appearing to do so. As Dorian embraces this worldview, his life becomes increasingly empty, even as it becomes more indulgent. He harms others without consequence, discards relationships without remorse, and gradually loses the ability to distinguish freedom from numbness. The portrait, hidden away, grows more grotesque with each act of cruelty and indifference. The image externalizes what Dorian refuses to confront internally, that moral corruption does not vanish simply because it is unseen. Psychologically, the novel explores repression and denial. Dorian does not become monstrous because he enjoys evil, but because he avoids self-examination. His greatest fear is not guilt, but recognition. The painting represents the self he refuses to integrate, the cost of living entirely on the surface. Wilde suggests that when conscience is silenced rather than resolved, it does not disappear. It mutates. Philosophically, The Picture of Dorian Gray is a critique of aestheticism when detached from ethics. Wilde famously argued that art should not be reduced to moral instruction, yet this novel demonstrates that beauty divorced from responsibility becomes destructive. The book does not argue for Puritanism, but for honesty. It exposes the lie that pleasure alone can sustain a meaningful life. As the story progresses, Dorian becomes increasingly isolated. His youth and beauty protect him socially, but internally he is fragmented. The final confrontation with the portrait is not an attempt at redemption, but erasure. Dorian seeks to destroy the evidence of his corruption without accepting responsibility for it. And the novel closes with the restoration of moral symmetry. What makes The Picture of Dorian Gray endure is how modern it feels. It speaks directly to cultures obsessed with image, reputation, and curated identity. It asks whether a life can remain whole when actions are hidden, when consequences are deferred, and when self-image becomes more important than self-knowledge. If this exploration sharpened how you think about beauty, responsibility, and the cost of living without accountability, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And if you want to continue exploring books that expose the psychological foundations beneath culture and morality, move on to the next video in this series.